Hello everyone and welcome to a new Sewing Through the Decades project. If you're unfamiliar with this series, I will link a video up here that explains it in more detail. Basically every month I follow an original historical pattern that corresponds with the decade. I've already tackled two patterns from 1900 to 1910, so now we're moving on to the 19s. I feel like the teenage years were awkward for all of us, and that applies to the 20th century too. This was sort of an interesting period for fashion, and not the most flattering, but it still remains one of my favorites since I think it's one of the few decades where you can see a clear transition from year to year. In 1910, S-bend corsets were still popular and being sold, as were full-length skirts with gored panels and pleats. However, in the teens, hemlines got a little bit shorter and dresses became boxier until they were falling pretty much straight from the shoulders down. This was a huge transition from the wasp-waisted, very fitted style of the Edwardian era, and was a precursor to the much boxier, loose-fitting dresses from 1920s. I definitely don't think you will see as dramatic a change in fashion from those 30 years in any other period, and I really like how you can slowly see that transition, how the 19s helps join two drastically different periods and silhouettes together. So I think it's very interesting. It's also not seen very much in the historical costuming community. A lot of people seem to skip over this decade, and even TV shows that take place in this decade sometimes skip over it because it isn't as dramatic looking as the silhouettes that came before and came after it. So I'm really happy to be shedding a little bit of light on this period, and this is one of the projects I was most excited to take on. I was really excited to follow this because it had a diagram on the front, it had a sketch of the completed garment, it had fabric requirements and a loose description of it, along with a template showing you how to cut the pattern out, and all of these instructions. As you will know if you've seen the first two videos in this series, those patterns didn't have a lot in terms of the instructions department, so I was really excited to have something that was a little bit more in depth and would hopefully be entertaining to follow. However, these instructions are complete and total gibberish. I don't know who wrote them and how they thought they were okay and how they thought anyone was going to be capable of following them, but they clearly did. I had a lot of struggles with making the mock-up for this piece and making the final dress itself, but I suppose that is part of the entertaining aspect of this project, that I'm trying new things and new methods and trying to follow these patterns to the best of my ability. Before getting into the video, I just want to mention that this project and this entire series are funded by Patreon, so if you enjoyed this video and you enjoyed this series and you want to see more of them, then I hope you will consider supporting me there. It gives you early access to my videos and also access to exclusive content like behind the scenes vlogs of me making the mock-ups for all of these pieces, along with other videos that are never going to be publicized on this channel. So please consider checking that out, and I really hope you enjoy this video. The material I purchased for this project is a 100% wool herringbone, made from gray, black, and brown fibers. Though day dresses would typically be made from lighter fabrics, wool would have been an acceptable choice for garments worn in the winter. And since it was quite cold at the time I made this, I decided to go in that direction. As I said in the intro, I purchased a pictorial review pattern for this project. It is described as a lady's one-piece costume without lining. It consists of 11 pieces, which allow for 3 different cuff options and 2 collar variants. This pattern is a size 34, and like the previous pattern in this project, the tissue was cut specifically for this size. This pattern claims to be patented on April 20th, 1907, but the design is much more representative of the teens in style, especially if you look at pattern catalogs from this period. This makes me think the patent date has to do with the construction or instruction method as opposed to the design itself, but I did find other patterns claiming to be from this period that look similar, even though this style isn't represented in any fashion catalogs until the mid-19s. The pattern pieces were all unmarked, aside from perforations. These were used to mark letters, grain lines, pleats, and even seam allowances. Notches indicate where the pieces will line up. These supposedly T-shaped perforations mean that that edge should be cut on the fabric's fold. Rectangular perforations mark seam allowance or the lap portions for the fabric. Large circles mark the waistline and the grain line. And the tiny circles are guidelines for cutting the pocket opening. Before getting to work, I ironed the pattern pieces, and I also reformatted the instructions and printed them out. The bigger text and more defined steps made them way easier to decode and follow. With that out of the way, I could finally lay out the pattern. I didn't follow their cutting diagram since my material is wider than their example, but I did pay attention to the grain line and fold markings when laying it out. Also, my table is topped with Homosote, which is a paper fiber board used for insulation, and soft enough that I can pin into it with push pins, so I'm using them instead of traditional straight pins during this process. I know I've gotten a few questions about that on previous videos. Now everything was cut out, and I added a little more than an inch onto the hem of the panel so I'd have room for a wider hem. I also made sure to clip every notch. These weren't quite as crucial as the ones on the Edwardian skirt, but they definitely helped make sense of the construction process. Since I have quite a bit of footage to play here, I'll go ahead and read you their cutting instructions. To cut. Avoid mistakes by laying out pattern on material in accordance to the cutting guide. Place pieces with edges marked by single or triple TTT perforations on the lengthwise fold of the material. The belt may be placed on a lengthwise or crosswise fold, and the remaining pieces with line of large O perforations on a lengthwise thread of the material. If desired, cut off points of flare cuff 3/8 of an inch below the indicating O perforations. When flowing sleeve section is used, cut off lower part of sleeve along cross line of small O perforations. Cut 4 pocket sections. For shorter costume, cut off from lower pieces of front, side front, and back, or turn a hem the desired amount. I couldn't have written it better myself, mostly because I wasn't alive in 1907. Here I'm cutting out the sleeves, side panel, and the belt. These, plus the 2 I cut out earlier, are the only crucial pieces to this design. The rest are interchangeable or even optional depending on your collar and cuff preferences. You'll see me cut those out later from a contrasting fabric. After everything was cut out, I got right into marking the perforations, of which there were plenty, like literally so many. For the front panels, there are dots marking the center front, the closure point, and the seam allowances, which is almost 3 inches wide in some areas. Since I was using a dark, relatively sturdy fabric, I could use chalk to mark these perforations through the pattern and onto the fabric. Then I connected the perforations to create cleaner lines to follow. On the side panels, there's more ridiculously wide seam allowance to mark, along with perforations showing the pocket placement, which were confusing as hell since there were also horizontal perforations at this point, marking the waistline, as well as vertical perforations marking the grain line, so I wasn't even entirely sure which ones were for the pocket. Speaking of the pocket, I decided to focus on that first. Though I really wanted to follow their instructions, they don't mention sewing the pocket in until the final step, and I knew it would be a million times easier to do it while the side panels were flat. Even though I'm going out of order, I'll still read you the pocket instructions, which were: slash the side front along line of 3 small O perforations and bind slashed edges. Join 2 pocket sections together and stitch around the edges, forming a bag, leaving an opening between the small O perforations. Sew pocket to opening inside front. So the first step was making binding to bind the edges of the slashed pocket opening. And I did this by cutting 2-inch wide strips of the wool on the horizontal grain line so the fabric would have some natural stretch. And I cut these so they were all the same length. Now I slashed the pocket openings. Slashed makes it sound like I went at it with a katana. Unfortunately, the reality is not that exciting. Though now I really want to see someone cut out a garment using a katana. I'm sure there's a video of that somewhere. I lined a bias cut strip up with the cut edge of the pocket and pinned it on. The edges were trimmed to be a 1/2 inch longer than the slash, then folded inward so the ends of the bias binding were level with the ends of the slash. This was repeated for the other side and the other pocket. I sewed the binding on with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, backstitching at either end. Then I ironed the seam and folded the binding inward so it hid the raw edge and had an even 3/8 of an inch width when viewed from the front. This was pinned down as well, and I wasn't too concerned about the interior, since the pocket bag will cover that. I top-stitched the binding into position as close to the outer edge as I could. With that done, I set the panels aside and turned to the first of their instructions, which were: turn side edge of front under on the slot perforations and lap on side front with notches and edges underneath even. Instead of just folding the fabric and pinning, I decided to iron it into that position first. The mentioned slot perforations were placed a good 2 or 3 inches away from the vertical edge and totally non-existent on the horizontal edge. In fact, the instructions make it seem like the horizontal portion of this piece is sewn much later on as a regular seam, which doesn't really make sense given the visible top stitching on the finished garment image. Let me read you the next couple steps so you can be confused with me. Stitch to position about 1/4 inch from folded edge from the yoke extension to the small O perforation in front section and close the seam underneath. And sew yoke extension to upper edges side front matching notches. Apparently after top stitching the other part? How and why were my main questions here. So like a normal person when confronted with things they don't understand, I ignored this. Instead, I'm turning the edges of the yoke extension inward too and ironing them down. I actually ironed the front edge of the right panel inward too, which is required for a later step. One thing I did figure out is lap on side front with notches and edges underneath even. The underneath part of that originally threw me off because it never occurred to me to pin lapped edges from the underside of the material, but it makes it way easier since you can see the notches and make sure the raw edges line up evenly. I used a few pins on the underside to line it up, then flipped it over and pinned it properly from the front side since that is the side I'm sewing on. Now I followed their top stitching instructions, sewing a 1/4 inch away from the folded edge. I wasn't sure what they meant by the instruction, close the seam underneath after top stitching the pieces together, but I thought maybe it meant sewing the raw edges together. Though I'm not sure what difference it makes, I did that for good measure. So again, I was going to follow their instructions, but they are stupid. They wanted me to sew the side and back panels together, then add closures way later on. But like with the pockets, adding closures to a flat piece of material is a million times easier than sewing them when the pieces have been stitched into a tube. So I'm skipping to the 4th instruction, which is line of small O perforations indicate center front, lap right front of costume on left with center front even and stitch to position below the double small O perforations. Finish the edges above perforation for closure. So I lined the front edge I ironed inward earlier on up with the chalk line marking on the center front and pinned them together. Then I sewed across the folded edge. They tell me to prepare front edge for closures, but never mention closures later on. So I decided to interpret this as add the closures of your choice. I wanted the dress to close with large buttons down the front, so here you can see me marking the buttonhole placement. I'm stitching the buttonholes using the automatic buttonhole option I have on my Singer Heavy Duty 4423. I have a more thorough review of this machine that will be linked above if you are curious. I didn't have high hopes for these buttonholes since home sewing machines don't always stitch densely enough for my taste, but they came out surprisingly well on my test swatches, so I used them for the garment too. Now I'm using a seam ripper and tiny scissors to cut open the buttonholes. I got this started with the seam ripper, then trimmed all the way up to the stitching with the scissors. Before declaring them done, I made sure the buttons I would be using fit through each hole. It's better to find out if they're too small now than when you are trying to get on the finished dress. To prevent any frayed bits from escaping the buttonhole, I put some fray check on either side of them, and I was pretty generous with this, but definitely do a test swatch first with this stuff, since it can darken or change the texture of some materials. As you probably guessed with the buttonholes, the closures I picked for this piece are buttons, specifically 29mm coverable buttons. This kit came with a template, buttons, shanks, the mold, and the pusher. Step 1 in using these is cutting out the fabric to physically cover the buttons using the template they provide as a guide. Then push the fabric into the mold with the right side of the fabric facing down. Pop the button on top, then fold the fabric surrounding the button inward over top of the button. Place the shank on top, then use the pusher to press the pieces together and form a functional button. Easier said than done. I've made a good 200 buttons in my time, but these were incredibly stubborn. I backed my material with interfacing to make it opaque enough that you wouldn't see the silver underneath, but I guess that made the fabric too thick, and the shank was bending instead of setting into the button. I did get this to work, but I had to use the heel of my hand to set them. Once my buttons were done, I marked their placement using chalk. I had somewhat idealistic views on button placement and forgot that shank buttons don't sit in the center of the buttonholes. They usually sit closer to the side of the holes when the garment has tension on it. It's funny the things you forget sometimes. So here you can see me sewing all the buttons on with 4 strands of thread. But I did end up removing them and re-sewing them on 1 inch further to the left of the garment. Also, I wasn't really sure what to do with the piece at the center front that sticks up. It obviously gets folded inward on the other side, but on this side it just hangs out there. I think I ended up trimming it off, then hemming the edge later on. Now I followed step 3, which was close underarm and shoulder seams as notched, which is pretty self-explanatory. Though this pattern overall calls for 3/8 of an inch at the seams to be used, they do note that the edges of the shoulder, underarm seam, and cuffs all have an additional 1 inch seam allowance. But if you take advantage of that, like I did, the collar needs to be made larger, yet somehow the sleeves still fit the arm side without alterations. I'm not sure what logic they used for that. And now it's time for the collar. Here you can see me cutting it out, along with the cuffs for the sleeves, and both of these were cut from silk charmeuse and backed with interfacing. And since I took advantage of the additional seam allowance in the shoulders, I had to add a pretty significant amount of material to the center back of the collar. This is something I learned from making the mock-up. And if you didn't know, I have videos about making mock-ups for every garment in the Sewing Through the Decades series, but they are exclusive to Patreon, so if you're interested, then check that out. I also added a little seam allowance around the collar since I liked the wider look. I used the charmeuse layer of the collar as a guide for cutting out the lining, which is a beige muslin. The pattern doesn't mention the collar lining or any way of finishing the edges, which seems to be a common theme with these historical patterns. Then I pinned the layers together with the right sides facing each other. I stitched around the side and bottom edges by machine with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. The top edge was left open so I could turn the collar right side out. The corners were trimmed off and I clipped the curves so it would turn out smoothly. Then it was turned the right way out and I used a turning tool to make sure the corners were nice and sharp. It got a thorough ironing and the collar was done. So now I could follow the instructions of sew to neck edge as notched, but weirdly the collar only had 2 notches marked where there were a good half dozen or so on the neckline of the dress. I'm not sure what those were supposed to indicate, so they were ignored, but I did match up the notches that were actually on the collar. It was stitched on with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and for this step the right side of the collar is facing the wrong side of the dress. It feels very wrong, but does work out in the end. I used the iron to press the collar outward, but I did most of the arranging with it on my dress form. To keep the collar positioned correctly, I had to add a tacking stitch to the front. I think this was necessary because I backed the fabric with interfacing, so it was a little stiffer than it was supposed to be. But even with the interfacing, the material was no heavier than a medium weight cotton, so this was kind of odd. Now it was on to sleeves. These look pretty unassuming, but the construction of them was slightly odd. The sleeves have a pleat in them that is top stitched down just above the wrist to add shaping, which I've never seen done before. Their instructions say, plait sleeve creasing on slot perforations, lap folded edge to small O perforations, and stitch. Leave edges free below large O perforation and finish for closing. So I went ahead and marked these perforations onto the right side of the sleeves using chalk. Then I connected the perforations so I had lines to use as a guide instead of depending on the dots. The fabric was folded at the line marked by slot perforations and pinned so it touched the line marked by dot perforations. Then I pinned from the top of the line to the large dot, which indicates where the stitching should end. This whole thing was really weird. I top stitched the sleeve pleats down around 1/4 inch away from the folded edge. The next instruction was, close seam of sleeve as notched, so I pinned the side edges and sewed them closed with a 1/2 inch allowance. The seams were ironed thoroughly. I always iron my seams, but with this thicker wool it was especially important for getting them to lay flat. The next step involved the cuffs. There are a few variations of these, and they don't appear to have instructions for the rectangular option I chose, which meant I got to make it up. So I sewed the short ends of the cuffs together with the right sides facing each other. I ironed that seam, then folded the cuffs so the long edges were touching and the right sides were facing outward, and I ironed this into position. I lined the seam up and pinned the cuff to the sleeve with the edges even, and the cuffs were actually slightly wider than the sleeve, so there was a lot of pulling involved with this, both during the pinning and sewing process. And they were sewn on with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then I folded the cuffs outward, and much like with the collar, I found them prone to shifting around, so I ended up adding a couple tacking stitches to each one so they would stay in place. Now on to attaching the sleeves. I neglected to write all of these instructions down and was originally quite annoyed by the lack of description, but they do actually tell you how to do this. They say, sew sleeve in armhole as notched with small O perforation at shoulder seam, easing any fullness between notches. Hold the sleeve toward you when basting it in the armhole. I didn't have to do much easing, the sleeve fit in the arm side pretty much perfectly, but I did take my time lining up the notches. I do have to give this pattern props in terms of fit and seam length. It was pretty true to size and everything lined up well except for the collar. And ironing was an important part of this piece, as I said earlier. So I used a tailor's ham and of course my iron to help smooth out the arm size seam. Now it's time to refocus on the pockets. Their instructions for these were, join 2 pocket sections together and stitch around the edges forming a bag, leaving an opening between the small O perforations, so pocket to pocket opening inside front. Now the problem with this was that the volume of the pocket bag was sticking straight out and causing rumpling underneath the dress fabric. So after trying their method and disliking the result, I changed it up a bit. I cut 2 pocket pieces following their pattern and 2 more that were an inch wider along the long edge. Then I folded the edges of all the pieces inward by a ½ inch and sewed them down by machine. Now I'm pinning these with the wrong sides facing outward, with the smaller pocket pieces on top of the wider ones. I also marked the opening that was shown on the pattern, then I sewed the pockets into a bag like they instructed. To install these, I lined the edge of the smaller pocket piece up with the binding on the interior of the pocket slit, then I whip stitched across this edge. Then I pinned the larger pocket piece to the other side of the pocket slit on the binding and whip stitched it down. This way the pocket sits really flat against the body. Now onto the hem. I had to level this since the side panels ended up a bit shorter than the front and back panels. I had planned on a generous 2-inch hem since that worked well in my mock-up, but after fitting this piece it was surprisingly short, so I went for a ½ inch hem, and the first step in doing this was binding the bottom edge with lace binding. I turned the bottom edge inward by a ½ inch and pinned it down, and I did this by eye. I'm really disappointed I couldn't do the 2-inch hem I had planned, but it did save me from having to mark the hem allowance with chalk, so I guess that is something. I sewed the hem with medium-sized whip stitches, only catching a few threads from the top fabric at a time to try and hide the stitching. This isn't the prettiest hemming stitch, but it is one of my favorites since it is so fast and easy. The hem was ironed, as was the rest of this costume. Now onto the belt. The instructions for this are, arrange around waist and close on left side. Though I appreciate the simplicity, I didn't think that would look that great, so I decided to line the belt first, and I used muslin for lining, which was cut to be a little narrower than the top layer of fabric. This way, instead of the lining being level with the edges of the top layer of fabric, it will sit slightly underneath and won't be at risk of peeking out around the edges. These layers were pinned, then sewn together with a ½ inch seam allowance. I left the short ends open and used them to turn the belt right side out. Then I top stitched a good ½ inch from each edge of the belt. The short ends were tucked inward and sewn down. The final step was sewing on the closures, which in this case were 3 hooks and bars. The ends of the belt overlap by about a ½ inch, which is why I used bars instead of hooks. And the belt is cut quite a bit larger than my waist measurement. Though dresses at this point weren't quite as wide as they were in the 20s, a fitted waist was no longer in style. The dress got a final iron and I made sure to test the buttons. And with that, it was done. This dress was paired with stockings and shoes from American Duchess. This specific style is called Moliere in the ivory variation. These are beautiful, but I'm terrified of getting them dirty, so wearing them is slightly stressful. The chemise is an old, very inaccurate one I made for a Victorian costume. The only accessory were my gold Downton Abbey earrings. Then the dress went on and was buttoned up. While I do this, let's all appreciate Darlene, the newest addition to my collection of figurines. She was mistakenly identified as Lady Charmaine and purchased on Etsy for a mere $22. Sadly, that is the type of thing I get really excited about. The dress is finished off with the belt, and this piece was ready to be photographed. Overall, I think this turned out pretty well. Despite the odd seam allowances, pleat placements, and my challenges with interpreting the instructions, the silhouette of this dress is perfect for the period, and I really like the design of it. I do think it ended up a little narrow for me in the shoulders, and the collar doesn't sit as well as it did on my mock-up, which is slightly frustrating, but I still like the finished piece. This is definitely a period I want to create more from, though I'll probably use my own patterns in the future. I'd love to know your thoughts on this piece, and if you'd like to see more of this project, along with behind-the-scenes videos and other bonus content of every project in this series, then please check out and consider supporting my Patreon. It'll be linked down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I really hope you enjoyed. If you did, I hope you'll stick around since there are lots more Sewing Through the Decades videos to come. Thanks again for watching, and I shall talk to all of you very soon.